A short story writer that I admire greatly is Gina Osner, whose collection People I Wanted to Be really, I think for me, set the benchmark of what short story writing should be about. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time, and I mean, you know, as a child, I spent a lot of time reading very old short stories very often, things like Arthur Conan Doyle and M.R. James. And it remains one of my real ambitions to write a really good ghost story, as M.R. James did, because I've never quite been able to get that right tone. I mean, coming back more up to date, I think Vanessa Gebbie is a very impressive writer. I write in a very kind of basic way. I sit on a very rickety old chair, which I keep having to stand up to straighten up, at a table that has to rest against a wall because it falls apart, and I write in notebooks using biros. And I do tend to be surrounded by clutter, mainly because I'm very, very bad at allocating time to get rid of stuff. Or rather, clutter or rather work in progress. All these bits of paper around me are bits of novels, bits of short stories, things that I have to print out, occasionally contracts that I have to sign, but they're things that once here tend to just sit here. Once a story gets published, then I tend to think, well, it's set in stone now. Once something is published, I don't tinker with it anymore because there is a public version of it. On the other hand, where stories are not published yet, they are subject to continued editing every time I try to get them published. So a story could go through 3, 4, 5, 6 edits. It isn't often that I completely junk something and start again with the same idea, although I have been known to do that on occasions. I think that when you're writing the first draft of a story, especially if you've got an idea of what the ending is going to be, then you work towards that point and you know that you've probably said enough and that any more will be too much. The question of when the text of it is actually finished after the editing process, though, is much more complex, because you can fiddle around for ages and never quite get to a kind of satisfactory solution if you're trying to find the perfect resolution of a story. I always find that I know where I'm trying to get to, or at least after a while I know where I'm trying to get to, but actually getting the tone of the resolution that first I imagined is often a lot more hard. I've had something of a shift in my body clock over the last few years, and I've become a lot more nocturnal. So what I tend to find now is that mornings disappear by and large because I'm doing other things. But writing in earnest doesn't tend to really get going until after lunch, and I'm often working until about 1 or 2 in the morning. So I tend to focus on evenings and nights. I continually aspire to have much more of a writing routine, to be someone who has a fixed number of hours per day that they work towards, or a fixed word count that they work towards. But I always find that things intervene to get in the way. My real problem is that I like to start things, and I think this is something which can sometimes afflict writers, that there's the attraction of the shiny and new always overcomes what you're meant to be doing. There's always a real attraction to starting something else, because the something else you start is going to be better, isn't it? And the problem then is you end up with 3 or 4 things in various states of unreadiness, and nothing ever gets done. And it's an incredibly hard habit to break, and I only wish I could. Perhaps hypnotism. Sometimes it can be useful to put something aside for a little while and then return to it. I think the difficulty that comes in, or the difficulty I have anyway, is when I'm working on a number of things at once. If I leave a particular piece to one side for too long, it's then recapturing that particular voice. At the moment I'm working on a novel which is about halfway through, which is my 5th novel. I do actually have another one completed, which I've been editing, tinkering around with for a couple of years and trying to interest publishers in. I'm also working on a graphic novel with a couple of guys in the States. I got in touch with a guy called Steve Stern, who was the inventor of Zen the Intergalactic Ninja. He created that graphic novel character, and him and the artist Jim Webb are currently helping me to turn it into a graphic novel. And again, that's 2013 territory. So with the enhanced ebook coming out, with burn lines, with the graphic novel, I'm also hoping though to get what I think in a rather old-fashioned way is a straight novel out soon as well. I think your own favourite short story is often the one that's made you most money. I couldn't honestly say I have a favourite, because I think all of them, the published and the unpublished, have merits among themselves. What I always find very touching is when a story is published and people actually bother to get in touch and say that it really affected them. In the Burn Lines collection, there's a story called Fennel Butter, about an older woman living in a retirement community who has a rather surprising past and still has a twinkle in her eye. And when that was published, a really quite large number of people emailed me and emailed the publisher to say that they'd really enjoyed it. And I think that is a very special thing when that happens. All stories start, for me anyway, with an idea. There's something I feel I want to say, there's a particular angle that I want to relate or describe, and very often that does mean starting with the end. And I think if you have the end clearly in your mind at the beginning, that is incredibly useful because it gives you a point to aim for. Usually I've got some idea of what the trajectory of a story is going to be, and in recent years I have got more into the habit of planning out short stories, writing a kind of one-page sketch for a short story before I start, in order to keep me on track towards where I need to be. But often you do have the idea for the conclusion first. Certainly with one of my novels, The Canal, which came out in 2008, I think, that actually began with the last line, and I had the last line very clearly in my head, and I wrote the novel to get to that last line specifically.